Welcome to this session of the CE4 CEE course on circular public transport. My name is Shiva Nouri. I am Circular Mobility Team Lead at CENEX Netherlands. In this short session, we'll explore the regulatory landscape shaping the shift towards circularity in public transport and see why policy is becoming the main driver behind more sustainable and resource-efficient bus systems across Europe. This session looks at electric buses within public transport system. By the end of this session, we'll be able to answer three key questions. Why? To revisit why circularity matters for public transport buses from resource use to supply chain resilience. What? To map the EU-level policies and regulations that are shaping circularity in the bus sector. And who? To identify who needs to act and what roles OEMs, PTAs, and PTOs play in making circular public transport a reality. EU's 2030 goal is clear. 9 in 10 newly manufactured city buses must be zero emission, such as electric or hydrogen. That's excellent for climate, but zero emission doesn't mean zero impact. As we electrify, impacts shift from burning diesel to critical raw materials such as lithium, nickel, and cobalt for batteries and electronics, while EU remains import-dependent for EV batteries. By now, 2025, China controls almost 85% of global battery cell capacity. To electrify public transport buses, we have moved through waves of adoption. First came early pilots in the Nordics and in the Netherlands, Helsinki's trials in 2015 and Eindhoven's 43 e-buses in 2016 showed feasibility. Then we hit area scale-up with landmark deployments, such as 100 bus fleet of Amsterdam Schiphol in 2018. Since 2020, rapid growth have pushed electric buses into a meaningful share of new sales. By 2024, zero-emission buses already made up about 1/5 of new bus registrations in the EU, a sign that we are entering the mass uptake phase. EU legislation now pushes this further. By 2030, 90% of all new city buses must be zero emission, reaching 100% by 2035. But every technology adoption is followed by waste stream when the technology reaches its end of life. As public transport electrifies, batteries and component waste will surge after 2030. Bringing new challenges for reuse, recycling, and resource recovery. Now we are seeing the first battery refurbishment and second life uses, a preview of circular challenges and opportunities ahead. This is why circular strategies such as lifetime extension, repairability, component reuse, and high-quality recycling must accompany decarbonization from day one. Here is the EU stack shaping circular public transport. Green Deal acts as an umbrella, and Circular Economy Action Plan is the backbone which drives the legislative pipeline and value chain priorities, not only for mobility sector, but also for textile, plastic, construction, and so on. Then we have cross-sector rules that shape the circular ecosystem in Europe. Eco-design for sustainable product regulation, or ESPR, sets the eco-design and digital product passport frameworks, specifically for OEMs. CSRD, or Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, creates transparency and data pressure. This new EU rule that tells companies, large and listed, public and private, to report clearly and in detail on their environmental and social impacts, not just on money. It's coming in stages. In 2025 for biggest listed companies to report on year 2024, and from 2026 to 29 for medium and smaller firms to join. Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive requires big companies to check their entire supply chain for human rights risks and environmental risks, and to fix problems or stop working with suppliers who cause harm. It is enforced since 2024. Countries must make national rules by 2026. Companies start applying it from 2027 to 2029, depending on size. Then, Waste Framework Directive is the horizontal law setting the waste hierarchy and the general rules for extended producer responsibility or EPR scheme. It doesn't itself mandate EPR for a specific product. It governs how EPR must be designed whenever the EU or a member state creates one. And then EU GPP or Green Public Procurement Criteria, which are voluntary technical clauses the European Commission publishes to help public buyers include environmental and often circular requirements in tenders for goods, services, and works. Road Transport GPP Criteria Pack gives ready-to-use clauses for vehicle procurement and transport services. Then we move to mobility-specific layer. First, HDV or heavy-duty vehicle. It is the EU performance standard that forces manufacturers of heavy-duty vehicles, trucks, buses, coaches, trailers, to cut average CO2 from new vehicles, now with tougher targets and broader scope, as we discussed. Battery regulation governs the whole battery life cycle. Design, safety, carbon footprint, due diligence on materials, labeling, battery passport, collection, recycling, recycled content targets, and producer responsibility. It entered in force in August 2023. Most applications phased in from 2024 onwards. CVD, or Clean Vehicle Directive, is EU rule that forces public buyers, including PTAs, PTOs, and service contracts, to meet minimum shares of clean vehicles in their procurement. Clean bus or entry here is based on alternative fuel definition, and zero emission bus is subsidized. Then ELV or End of Life Vehicle Directive, which limits hazardous substances and makes OEMs responsible for take-back treatment and sets reuse and recycling targets. Now, its scope mainly covers cars and light vans. Buses and heavy trucks are largely out of scope today in 2025. But upcoming ELVR moves from waste end rules to full life cycle circularity and fixes missing vehicles and gradually extends the scope, very likely to lorries and buses. And at the end, at this layer, we have AFIR, Alternative Fuel Infrastructure Regulation, that sets binding EU-wide targets for electric recharging and hydrogen refueling across roads plus ports and airports. EFA ensures the infrastructure backbone is there for zero-emission buses and coaches. Although urban buses mostly charge at depot and terminals, and EFA doesn't force depot specs, but it guarantees interurban corridors. EFA's standardization plus open payment and data rules support modularity and circularity. And then we have Euro 7, which is the next generation of pollutant emission standards for vehicles in EU, adopted in 2024 and will apply gradually from 2027 to 2030, depending on vehicle category. Even though zero-emission buses don't have tailpipe pollution, Euro 7 still connects to circularity, as it requires longer durability of emission control systems and monitoring of performance over time, and takes into account non-exhaust emission. Financial enablers are EU grants such as EFA and Innovation Fund or financial instruments like ELENA or InvestEU. Moreover, market shapers like taxonomy and CEAG define eligibility rules and what counts as green. EU taxonomy creates a single EU rulebook that says when an economic activity is environmentally sustainable for finance and reporting. So, looking back, taxonomy defines what is green. CSRD makes you report on it, and CSDDD makes you manage your supply chain. So, it truly is green and fair. Guidelines on state aid for climate, environmental protection, and energy are European Commission's rulebook for when member states can finance green projects in form of subsidies, grants, tax breaks, etc., without distorting the single market. Parallel to all of these, there are monitoring and alignment instruments such as Eurostat Circular Economy Monitoring Framework and Zero Pollution Action Plan. Achieving circular public transport is truly a shared responsibility, like any other circular transition. Circular public transport means different roles and actions for different levels of stakeholders. At EU level, we have policy DGs, funding and implementation, industrial alliances, and monitoring and standards organizations. Policy DGs set the regulatory framework and funding programs, while alliances like EBA and ERMA strengthen the industrial backbone. At international level, we have ministries, transport, industry, economy, energy, and so on. We have managing authorities for EU funds, and we have national standardization bodies and regulators. The national level transposes and enforces EU law and uses incentives to guide market. At regional and local level, cities, regional governments and PTAs translate policies into procurement, planning, and operations. PTAs sometimes act between regional and operational level. Finally, at operational level, PTAs, OEMs, circular value chain actors turn policy into practice in designing, maintaining, and recycling assets. Together, these layers form a loop. Data and experience from operations feed back into policy, ensuring circular learning ecosystem. That was it. Thank you for joining this session of CE4CE course on regulatory landscape for circular public transport. We invite you to reflect on how these insights can shape actions in your own city, region, or organization. Circularity is not a distant goal. It starts with the next tender, the next maintenance decision, the next conversation with your supplier. Explore other C4C modules to discover more perspectives and practical tools for accelerating circular public transport. What could your organization do tomorrow to make your fleet circular?